I might get a bit philosophical here, and it's probably fair to say that over the centuries, people who've been teachers and philosophers have often talked about the fact that you get out of life what you believe you can get out of life. So, for example, if you say, I can do that, then quite often you can. On the other hand, if you doubt yourself and think, oh, no, don't think I can do that, then sometimes you really can't. Well, it would seem that science has now put a little bit of a scientific, I suppose, tick next to all of this. It seems, according to science, the key to living a more positive life lies with the way that we approach different situations and in learning how to adjust thinking and to focus so we can ensure better outcomes and experiences. So I suppose it's probably a combination of believing that you can do something, but also, I guess, having a little bit of wisdom to know that something may be beyond you and being able to understand why, because you may be able to go a lot further than you've already gone thus far, but sometimes maybe you want to go a little bit further. I guess it's really the difference between being adventurous and reckless and finding that happy balance. Anyway, we're joined on the program this evening by Wrang, who's, I suppose we would call him the positive lane. Hi, Hans.
Hi, Chris.
Is that fair? You're quite happy to be called the positive lane, are you?
Well, that's the name of my organisation because we always say get out of the fast lane and get into the positive lane.
Yeah, well, I suppose sometimes you can be in the fast lane and that can also be the reckless lane. And there is something, isn't there? There is something about being positive, but also having a little bit of realism attached to it.
Well, that's absolutely right. One of the things that I often talk about when I go out and talk to people about this is there was a movement called positive thinking some years ago, and one of the thoughts that were around at that time was that if you only ever thought positive thoughts, then nothing bad would ever happen. And we all know that isn't actually real, that things do happen in life, and there are a lot of things that can't be controlled. Science hasn't quite put a precise number on it, but it's often thought that at least half of the things that happen to us in life are things that you just can't control. What you can control is how you deal with it or how you approach it. And it was interesting that you talked earlier about the way that we kind of see things. One of the things that science has discovered is the way the brain works is that we are presented on a daily basis with somewhere in the region of 65 to 70,000 pieces of stimuli, things we see, hear, etc. But we only consciously pick up around 3,000 of those. Now, what's interesting is that the things we pick up are aligned with our values or the things that are more important to us, and also the things that we pick up become evidence of our beliefs. So if you believe a certain thing, so for example, if you're playing golf and you believe that you just can't chip, and then every time you do a bad chip, then it doesn't work, you tell yourself, well, see, there, I knew that because what you saw and felt became evidence of that belief. What you can do, though, is you can change the way you look at things. You can change the things you actually observe and start to pick up new evidence, potentially of a different belief, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and of course what you're talking about there, and it's really interesting you use the golf analogy because you happen to be talking to a golfer. But what's really what's really interesting there is it all comes down to, like you say, this belief system. And I guess, though, the difference is if you look at something and say, for example, you talk about a chip, well, reality is in golf, anyone who's a golfer could potentially do a good chip. There's no question about that. And like you say, it's about believing in it and the mental part that comes into play. What about when people set themselves a task where there's a bridge too far? In other words, they arguably set themselves up in a situation where realistically they're not going to succeed, certainly not in the short term.
Well, that's another interesting point, Chris, because one of the things we often talk about is, yes, of course, there are things that you just are not going to be able to do. What I often suggest to people is, and it might actually sound like almost too common sense, but do what you can. Don't do what you can't. And we often hear about the stories of people who do extraordinary things, and that we have to believe that we can, and that is absolutely correct. We have to believe that we can do things that we might not otherwise have thought we could. But focus on the things that you can do. Focus on the things that are working. Focus on all the things that are right. Because part of the problem for a lot of us is that we have a natural tendency as human beings to focus on the things that are not working, focus on the things that we just can't do, focus on all the things that are not right. And the problem with that, again, if you sort of think or look at it scientifically and in terms of how the brain functions, is that every time we have a thought, we strengthen the neural pathways in the brain associated with that thought, and then it just becomes a belief, and then everything we see around us strengthens that belief or confirms that belief. Whereas if you change the way that you think, you develop new neural pathways. So if you focus on, so you take a situation and you continuously focus on, I can't do this and I can't do that, and look instead at the other side of the coin and say, well, that's fine, but then what can I do? Or I don't have this. I don't have this beautiful big house on the hill. I don't have, $150,000 Mercedes Benz. But okay, look at what do you have? What do you have that really is aligned with what you value and what's important to you? And the more you focus on those things, funnily enough, things then change on the other side, and suddenly things appear in your life that you didn't necessarily think that you were going to get, because now you've focused on all the things you do have, all the things you can do, all the things that are right.
The points that you've made there, Hans, that I find really interesting are the fact that we, especially nowadays, we have this mindset where we're so scared, for example, with the young people about their self-esteem and what have you, that we hide failure from them. And by doing that, we hide reality. There was a time when failing was actually called learning, because you might do something, you might fail at it, so you go, okay, I went about that the wrong way. You took what you got from that failure, you learned from it, so the next time you had to go at whatever the task was, you'd adapted your approach, you'd taken into account what had worked against you, you'd tried new ideas to make them work for you, and all of a sudden you got a better result. But nowadays, why is it that we have this abhorrence? We're almost frightened. It's almost seen as being some sort of abuse to say to children, well, you failed that time, didn't you? Yeah. What are you going to do next time?
That's right. It's almost become politically incorrect to point that out. One of the people whose research I often quote in the stuff that I work with is an American guy called Dr. John DeMartini, and one of the things that he said, which I quote quite a lot, is that there is no such thing as failure. There's only feedback. Because every time we do something that didn't work exactly the way that we wanted it to do, you're absolutely right. We say, oh, you failed. Well, no, I got feedback to say that didn't work. So now what I have to do is two things. I have to learn from that and say, well, what is it that feedback gives me? And I also now have to say, well, so if it didn't work, then what did I get out of that situation that I can now use to take me where I need to go?
Well, the answer would be lots of things, but we hide that from people now, don't we? We don't teach people to say, here's what you got from this and learn. And, of course, one of the things that I think still holds true that for some strange reason we also don't seem to teach people anymore, and that is that the art of stupidity really is doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. Yeah, part of learning from a failure, whatever word you want to put to it, is that you do it differently. And by doing it differently, you're almost inevitably going to produce a different result.
Absolutely correct. And one of the things that worries me a little bit is you talk about young people, and obviously young people are very impressionable, and we need to teach them that failure is not a bad thing. In fact, there is no such thing as failure. We need to teach them that doing something that didn't get them the desired result is not a bad thing, as long as they take from that what they can to then take them to the next step. But one of the other things that worries me is I do a lot of work in companies, and we are getting to the point also where a lot of companies just don't tolerate failure, if you like, and people become so afraid of doing the wrong thing, of taking risks and doing things that just they should be doing, but they become afraid of it because they become afraid of failure. I can tell you, people like Richard Branson did not get to where he got to by being afraid of failure.
No, of course not. Of course not. But the problem is now, and I think one of the things that we often forget in companies now, a lot of it's been dehumanised. You have, for example, bean counters who sit behind computers and say, this is how we can save money. But what they don't do when they do that is take into account the human factors. The fact that things sometimes don't go as expected. The fact that somebody may not perform to their absolute best ability every time. And that can also be applied to machines. I mean, we all know even machines malfunction, the best of them. So therefore, what happens is we're creating this unreal world. And I think also another problem that comes, especially where, and I've got to say where young people are concerned, because we're not teaching them to accept and learn from failure, they're not responsive once they enter the workforce to constructive criticism. And what that means is they feed back to people whether they realise it or not. Don't tell me something, Hans, I already know.
Yeah. When
they don't. And that, I think, is also feeding the problem as well.
It is. And also an extension of that is don't tell me something, not just because I already know, but I just can't cope with it. If you tell me something that appears to be I've done something wrong, I always have to be right. And I'm not 100% sure where that has all crept into society, but it has. And I think one of the things that we have to do where possible is to help people to understand that it's okay to make mistakes, because mistakes are the things that actually become, and Henry Ford said it many years ago, and I don't remember the exact quote, but Henry Ford all those years ago said much the same thing, that mistakes, and in fact I think he said even mistakes become the things that become your greatest teachers. Because if you only ever do things right, you don't really learn, you coast. But if you make mistakes and you accept the consequences of those mistakes, but then, and this is one of the critical things that we often talk about, is then don't dwell on them, don't beat yourself up about them, consciously think to yourself, what can I take from this that's going to take me the next step? What can I use this for good, rather than beat myself up? And unfortunately, there are people who suffer badly from depression and various other forms of emotional illness or unwellness, if I can put it that way, because they beat themselves up about the things that didn't work and the things that they don't have. Instead of looking at, well, what do I have and what is working? Because then I can use that. I can't use what's not working. I can use what is working.
Makes a lot of sense. Been an absolute pleasure. Hans Wrang from The Positive Lane, thank you so much for your time.
It's been my pleasure.